Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here, to the alumnus, the staff, and of course, Dr. Banerjee, who I prefer to call Ranjan. I don't think many of you in the room know that Ranjan and I went to school together, and we've actually played cricket and Chor Police as kids. But that's another story. He's still Dr. Banerjee in this room. There have been some truly inspirational stories we've heard in the last couple of hours, and stories of life and strength and achievement. My story is about one of my hobbies. She's very kind in saying that I'm a marathon runner. I have run a few half marathons and a few other things, but driving has been my most enduring hobby. And the story and the dream actually started 40 years ago, Ranjan. This is when you and I were in school together. There was an event called the London-Sydney Rally, which in its second edition in 1977 actually passed through Bombay, as it was called then. I jumped school with a couple of other guys from class, and we went out to watch the event, which was taking its break at the Oberoi, not far away from school. And I was completely enamored by the whole event. There were all these fast cars that had driven across from London and come into Bombay, and they were going across on to Sydney. And I think that stayed in my mind all through. Fast forward to the 80s, I did a few motor car rallies, and then into the 90s, whenever we traveled, incidentally, that's my son sitting there, so whenever the family and I traveled together, we'd always rent a car and I'd drive around. So I had a chance to drive many other parts of the world. In the 2000s, I got lucky because I got a chance to do 2 or 3 long events where I drove once from Singapore to India as part of the ASEAN car rally, and then I did the SParc rally a few years earlier, where we drove from Bangladesh, and I had the privilege of driving across Wagah into Pakistan. And then I got lucky because I got together with a bunch of similar-minded guys. Coincidentally, several of them were runners. And we started doing these annual trips and making it really challenging. We started driving into remote areas of India. So we did trips into the Himalayas, we did Ladakh, we did Himachal. This was in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's always been that car there. This car's actually parked right outside the institute right now. And so it's gone into the Himalayas several times. It's gone across the Rann of Kutch. And on our last trip, we decided that we'd take this across borders, and it was my dream to do not London to Sydney, but London to Mumbai. So I put together these photographs, which will take you through it. But before I go there, I thought I'd just touch upon some of the big challenges that came about, because unlike any of the other drives I'd done, when I thought about setting up this drive, this trip for myself and for the guys I was with, the hardest part of the event was actually finding people to go with. And that takes me back to some of the things that the other speakers have said, that I think we sometimes lose focus of what we can do, and we let it all pass by. While we all have the health, we thought we'd do it, because I think most of us, at least the guys I was with, are at that point in life when we can afford this, and yet have the health to be able to do something like this, because this wasn't easy by any stretch of imagination. It was a 21,000 kilometer drive, and it took us across 15 countries. So that was the tagline of our endeavor. And so we shipped this car across to London from JNPT sometime in July this year. So this drive actually took place between August and October. We've just finished about 8 weeks ago. And as I was saying, the difficulty of finding a team of guys to go with eventually made me do the first part of the drive with 3 women. So the lady in the front seat of the car is my wife. She's not here right now with me. And the other 2, so I did this first bit of the drive. This is from London to Moscow with 3 women, the wives of 2 of the co-drivers who are joining me later in the drive. So here's a little bit about the first part of our route. It took us across the English Channel, which I put the car onto a train. And that was an interesting experience as well. Then we drove across from Belgium into Germany, stopped over in Berlin for a couple of days, and then through Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and into Russia. So these are just snapshots of the early part of the drive. So it was quite an exciting thing for us to have an India-registered car parked in at the Houses of Parliament or at St. James Court or outside Buckingham Palace. And then we took it across. So these are the three ladies. This is my wife here, and the other two are friends, and they're wives of the other guys I was with later in the drive. And we put it onto this train. This is pretty unique also because the other way people usually take cars across, not that many people do this, is to put it onto a ferry, but we did it on the Channel train. This, of course, is, we stopped over in Dunkirk, and this was a couple of months after the famous movie, which Hollywood had produced a couple of months earlier. So it was exciting to be there at the beach. That's the beach of Dunkirk. Went up onto the tower, and then across further down. So one of the big challenges so I got to touch upon this for those who are interested in knowing this bit. A few people in India do drives from India between India and the UK every year. You read about maybe 20 or 30 people doing this. Almost everyone does it as part of a convoy. We did it in one car, and there was only 3 of us for the bulk of the drive. So driving a right-hand drive car entirely on the wrong side of the road poses its own challenges, but we thought we had the experience to be able to make it work, and it went off pretty flawlessly, all said and done. So these are some pretty iconic spots in Berlin. There's Checkpoint Charlie and the Brandenburg Gate. Exciting city, and of course this is the wall. So we stopped over. So every 3 or 4 days we do a 2-night stop, otherwise we are basically driving virtually every day of the trip. So the average driving days would be 600 or 700 kilometers. And we did stop wherever there was something worth looking at. It's not that we just drove mindlessly from morning to evening. We'd stop if we see a good place for a meal, if we see something of tourist interest, or we just wanted to take a break, or even a nice coffee stop, we'd stop over. And evidently, we were also item of interest for the cops and for a lot of people all across the drive. So this big Polish cop came and stopped me and interrogated me for a bit. He claimed he was taking photographs of the car, but I think he suspected that we shouldn't have been where we were. More shots of the earlier part of the drive. So the way I'd actually done it was that this was the more civilized part of our drive when we were driving through Europe. So that's when I had the all-ladies team barring me, of course. Vilnius, capital of Lithuania, a really beautiful city. Some of these countries were an eye-opener. We only read about them, but when we actually visit them, we see that they're really civilized, lovely places. Of course, there are signs of the communist era, and that they've been 20, 25 years out of communism is still evident, but it's still fascinating to see this. Latvia, on the other hand, was a bit of a sad eye-opener because we thought that it would be pretty similar to Lithuania, but it was a very, very rundown sort of country. We only spent a day there, and Google kept taking me off the highway for some reason and kept saying the shortest route is through these dirt tracks. So I was having a good time driving on dirt because I enjoy doing that sort of stuff, but we didn't know whether we were really going to get to our destination that day. And then eventually we crossed the border into Russia. We did 16 border crossings on this trip, and each of them had its own challenges. It was quite unique, and especially the one where we drove into China, because this was just on virtually 3 or 4 days after the Doklam issue had been resolved mercifully for us, between India and China. It could have been different had the issue still been going on between the two countries. And so these are the guys. This is one of the guys who joined me for the second half of the drive, and these are shots of Moscow. That's, of course, the Red Square. And for those who've seen Moscow, you'll know that the stations are something that they're a work of art in themselves. I mean, there's chandeliers and sculpture and murals and paintings all over. It's certainly a city worth visiting. And that's, of course, iconic shots of this is the Bolshoi Theater and the Kremlin. Okay, and so this is where the so-called bait and change took place, and the ladies left the trip, and these are the other 3 guys I continued this drive with. That's the second half of the drive. Now, this is where it got really exciting, because so for those who are interested in these sort of details, there are 2 routes that basically connect India to Europe, and the other route is the one that goes south through Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and eventually comes back into Russia. You cannot avoid driving through China. You have to go through China. And then you have the option of doing the northern route, which is the one we took through Siberia. So most of these cities head into the Urals, and then when you pass Chelyabinsk, which is somewhere in the middle of that map, you enter Siberia. So we drove 6,000 kilometers east of Moscow eventually to Lake Baikal. which is the easternmost point of our drive. It's truly an eye-opener because we tend to think of Russia only as St. Petersburg and Moscow, and then you see these fabulous cities like Kazan and Ufa and Chelyabinsk and all of them. So these were some of my other driving passions. Took me into all the vehicle dealerships, and I try and bum a couple of free rides off them in their fancy cars, just as a break from driving. And so we thought, people thought that we were doing something quite adventurous and crazy till you meet guys like this guy who's solo on a bike for the last 16 months of his life, and he's doing a 45,000 kilometer trip, which is twice as long as what we were doing. And then, of course, we meet a guy who's on a bicycle doing it from London to Auckland, once again solo, so that puts our whole drive into perspective, you know. And then, of course, Siberia is just hundreds and hundreds of miles of forest land and farmland, and it's just extremely desolate and exciting to drive if one likes those sort of things. And of course, the high point of the drive, or if I'd say one of the most memorable incident to happen on the drive, this is another beautiful city which is considered the capital of Siberia, although Siberia isn't a state. It's Novosibirsk, which we spent 2 or 3 nights at, and we just took a break there. We went to the opera. So we had a bit of a change from the whole driving routine. So when we were out of Novosibirsk and going further east, our car broke down. So this is on the most remote part of our drive when we were in Siberia that we blew the radiator of the car. So it posed a bunch of challenges to us. We had to figure out how, language is a huge, huge hurdle, mostly across Europe, China, Russia and China for sure. So we had the language barrier, we had the distance barrier, and of course we didn't know where this was heading. This is an old car, it's not in production in Russia any longer, so getting parts is not too easy either. In any case, we figured it out, and I think one of the takeaways from the trip, which I've also touched upon, is the fact that when we were in a crisis situation, we started really innovating, thinking a little bit out of the box, trying to figure out ways. The other 2 guys were working on different aspects of it. I was the guy who was supposed to be the expert on the car, so the decision on how to fix it lay with me. Trying to figure out, get in touch with Mitsubishi in India to try and figure out where to get the part replaced or sent or flown to. I left to the other 2 guys, and that's how we worked as a team. It was an exciting 2 days till we fixed it, and we had to eventually do a part of the trip on a flatbed truck. We put the car onto a flatbed, got it into some service, and finally got ourselves going again. So we managed it pretty well, and we lost only 1 day of the drive. And we skipped out on one city which we should have been staying at, and we proceeded and came on to, and then we proceeded further down into Siberia, and this is more or less towards the end of the Russia leg of the drive when we hit Baikal. Lake Baikal, for those who may not know, is the largest, the deepest lake in the world, and I think 1/4 of the world's freshwater supply is in this one lake. It's unbelievably huge. It's a sea. You know, you just can't look across the lake, or I think it's 2,000 kilometers. The shoreline is more than 2,000 kilometers long. So that was the easternmost point. It's 2.5 hours ahead of Indian Standard Time. So that's how far east our drive went, and then we headed south from there through Russia into Mongolia. So this was one of the fun places we stopped at. And then we crossed over. So of course, moving from Russia to Mongolia is quite a change because Russia, we tend not to think about it when we are there. It was a superpower. Maybe it's not so much of a superpower now, but it still has remnants of that. Mongolia is a relatively less developed economy. So I think I've overstayed the time. I didn't realize that this was the timer for me. So I'll fast forward through that. We drove through the Gobi Desert and then, of course, eventually into China. This was an interesting day when I fell badly because I was trying to help some guy whose truck was on fire. And just a brief run through of the time zones we went through. And that's the final leg of our drive, which came right through China into Laos, Myanmar, Thailand and Myanmar before we entered India. The second high point, I'd say, was undoubtedly, of course, the China leg was exciting in its own way. It's a different country to drive through, highly regimented, monitored. You have to specify which route you're taking. You cannot leave that route. You will be asked questions and you could be even arrested, I'm told. So we stayed pretty much on the straight and narrow. The car gets a new registration, new insurance, new papers. You get a new driving license. That's the forbidden city in Beijing. It's impossible to get through that country without local support, so we had a guide in our car for the entire leg of China. And of course, these are the Injian, the terracotta warriors. This is Xi'an. And then we kept moving further down. This is when we had another change of guard. The guy with the beard in the black left us in Chengdu, and this chap joined us. And he stayed with me right through. That's also Chengdu. And China has probably the most amazing road network in the world. I mean, having recently driven through Europe, I could compare it, but China seems to be years ahead. And then we came into Laos, crossed over soon thereafter into Thailand, and eventually made our way into India. That was extremely special for us because the last day was a bit of a touch and go. The border closed at 3, and we had a 600-kilometer drive in Burma. It's not the best road network in the world. So we started that drive at 2:30 the previous night. And this was the final day when we blasted down to the border, literally blasted to the border. And we made it well in time, crossed over happily into India, and had the pleasure of spending that night, the first night we came into India, with the Assam Rifles, who hosted us at the military base there, the officers' mess. And we had a lovely evening with them. We cracked open a bottle of champagne and celebrated our successful drive. And then the drive came straight from Imphal further down to Mumbai. And this is where we finish it off at the Gateway of India on the 15th of October. That's about literally 2 months away, 2 months ago. And there's not much I can say in terms of philosophizing about the drive, but I'd just like to leave you all with this thought that the most common refrain I've been hearing since I've returned from the trip is that you could actually, at your age, okay, I'm older than almost all I think I'm the oldest ex-student or alumnus in this room. I was in the class of 87. So they say, how could you do this and how could you take 45 days out of your life? And I think all of us who are on the trip for the bulk of that drive came back and concluded that really nothing had changed. The world goes on without us, and we shouldn't let ourselves feel that we are so important to the grander scheme of things that we can't take time off ourselves. And of course, because this is an issue, a topic close to my heart, I've invested quite heavily in my own fitness over the years because of my running and my other fitness passions. It pays rich dividends at times like this. It's not going to guarantee a long life, but as many years as you have, you will have a better chance of enjoying it than if you let yourself go. And I think the final last statement I leave you with is something I even said here, is that if you really want something, the universe conspires to make it happen. These are just the stats, the final stats I'll leave you all with. And thanks for listening to the little story.